There's this book on grit, and in it, the author, she studies grit, but she tells a story about West Point, where West Point, it's a military academy, and it's really hard to get into West Point. You have to actually start in junior high, working on your grades and all this other stuff. You need recommendations, but you have to have academically the best grades, athletically, you have to show skill, and it's really hard to get in because they only take the best. And out of every 100 kids that apply to West Point, they only take 10. So it's really hard to get in. But they have this problem that they have all this hard criteria to get in, academically, physically. They take these psychological tests. But the problem is that 1/5 of the classes were dropping out in the first 2 months. Basically, they couldn't hack it. And so they brought in this, professional psychologist to find out how they can figure out who's going to drop out and who's not going to drop out. And her name is Angela Duckworthy. So she remembers, before she got a PhD in psychology, she was actually a math teacher. And she remembers that as a math teacher, there's certain kids that they just have a talent for math. Like, they would catch on really quick. And she was thinking those kids that have a talent at math, that by the end of the year, they'll be so much farther ahead. But they weren't. The ones that earned the top grades were always the students that would ask a lot of questions, practice more, and she was just kind of shocked that talent doesn't mean you're going to get the best grades. Actually, hard work does. So she studies these West Point cadets, and she actually came up with a grit formula, an equation. And what it is talent times grit. You take a psychological test on how gritty you are. So it's talent, like some people are just born dancers, like the deacon and me. Some people are, born with, math skills. That's talent. So it's talent times grit, and then the other equation is skill, which you've learned, times grit. So grit counts twice as much. The most important quality you can have for success is grit. And her equation turns out right. You can predict success, not by talent, but by grit. And then she applied it to everything. Kids on spelling bees. You can predict who's going to be the top tier on spelling bee by really how they test out on grit. And it works out shockingly for everything. Even marriage. You can tell which marriages are going to turn out by how much grit you have, which I find, like, as a celibate, kind of shocking because, grit is like resiliency and stubbornness. And, how much pain you can endure. So, like, as a celibate, I'm like, marriage is about how stubborn you can be and how much pain you can endure. Successful marriage, they did on salesmen. It always comes down to grit, which I like. And as I said, there's different words for grit. Stubbornness. One of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is resiliency. That's grit. And the problem is, in the United States, we like the myth of talent. Now, you're just born better at math, and I'm not a numbers person. We like it because it gets us off the hook. Now, we really don't have to work hard because I just don't have that talent. But the truth is, it's not talent. It's actually grit and determination that is the factor for great success. Except to have grit, this is the hard part. To have grit, you have to be able to fall on your rear end and get up and try again and again and again. For somebody to have grit, they have to know what it means to sacrifice. Sacrifice and falling down and getting up, that teaches you grit. And I mention this because all the readings deal with it. But not all the readings, but we as a community need it. And so at St. Ignatius, the theme this year is going to be grit, except we're going to say it in Basque. And you say, why Basque? Well, St. Ignatius was Basque. And, so that's one. And also, like, personally for me, I admire the Basque generation in front of me. They were gritty. The word in Basque is gogora. They are gogora. I mean, you can throw a rock at these Bascos, and it just bounces right off them. They're incredible. In fact, we have this group of Basque ladies who, every time one of them has a celebration, they go to a city and celebrate. They just get wild. And they're really joyful. And one of them, went to New York and they come back, and one of them had a broken foot. And I said, well, why didn't you, go to the doctor? Someone said, I knew now listen to this. She says, she laughs and says, well, I knew my foot was broken, but I'm not going to let a broken foot get in the way of a good time. And they have found that people who have grit turn out to be happier. That if you want your kids to be happy, you don't wish them an easy life. What you do is teach them how to sacrifice and get up. And what they found out is that a family or community, they can teach the next generation how to be gritty, how to have gogora. Angela Duckworthy said in her family, thinking about it, that's what her parents taught her. Like her dad would say almost every day, life is about sacrifice. Or we have a family here at Holy Apostles who their motto is, when things get tough, the tough get tougher. Isn't that a great motto? Now, and believe it or not, kids learn that. But if you teach your kids, no, life is supposed to be easy and, whine if things go tough, you're actually making your child's life harder, less chance of being happy. Like Angela Duckworth, another one, after she did all this study on grit, when she had her kids, starting in elementary school, their family would say, what is one hard thing you did today? And they'd ask their kids that because, and they're honest, they want their kids to learn grit. Do one hard thing. And when they were teenagers and they took up a sport, if they weren't good at the sport, they'd say, great, you're going to stick with it for the year because it's not about being a great sportsman. It's about having grit. We're thankful you're not great at that sport, and we're going to make you stick with it. A family and a community, they can teach the next generation how to be gritty. And so on St. Ignatius, it's going to be on the back of their T-shirts, Gogora. I'm actually going to write it on the wall in the foyer. And the reason why is that this year during COVID, the school is going to be tougher. They'll have to wear a mask all day. And there's no whining. There's no crying in baseball. That's from a movie. I get tired of full-grown adults whining about the mask. For God's sakes, you are setting a bad example for the next generation. They need to learn grit. And kids will often ignore what their adults say, but they never ignore the example. If one of the prize examples in our parish and in our families is Gogora, grit, we're giving our kids the skills and the tools of happiness and success. We want them to end up as happy. But here's the other thing. Holiness is not possible without grit either. Look at all three readings today. In a way, they deal with grit, Gogora. The first reading is Jeremiah, and it's painful. Jeremiah, he loves God, he loves his people, but religion for him has been a terrible cross. It's been a sacrifice. And yet, he can't help but lean into love, even when it costs him a lot of pain. That is grit. Or the second reading from St. Paul, where St. Paul says, don't conform yourself to the modern age. Don't conform yourself to an easy life. We're supposed to be a living sacrifice. If you think religion is supposed to make life easy, you got the wrong religion in Catholicism. Catholicism is supposed to make us a living sacrifice. We give and give and give. Or even the gospel, where Peter, if you remember, he says to Jesus, you are the Christ. And then Jesus says, Jesus' way, the way of the Christ, is the way of the cross.
where he said, I will suffer, die, I will accept the cross. And Peter hears us about suffering and pain. And he takes Jesus aside and says, Jesus, this is not going to play in Peoria. Nobody wants to hear this message. You got to give the message of, if you follow the Christ, then everything's going to be rainbow and sunshines. God's going to line your pockets with gold. And what does Christ say to Peter? He turns his back on Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. So just the word Christ, it means, yes, the anointed one, but the word Christ has with it this idea of sacrifice. And I say that because the American spirituality is much different. There's a very famous televangelist who said, because Christ died on the cross, we no longer have to suffer. No. Christ was showing us the example of how we gain holiness and happiness. And that is by accepting our crosses, not complaining about them. And when we fall, we pick ourselves up like he did. The way of holiness is the way of the cross, where we die to our ego. It's very popular in American spirituality to say, if you follow Christ, he's going to line your pockets with gold. If you follow Christ, what he offers us is the way of the cross. So the way of our religion is that of the cross. If you're following a Christ that says, no, everything's supposed to be easy and smooth and soft, that's Satan's view of Christ. Remember, Jesus calls Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan. If you're following a religion that says, oh, no, God is supposed to make your life easy, no, that's Satan's way. The same way parents, if they're good parents, they teach their kids how to sacrifice. If they're good parents, they teach their kids how to be gritty. You're just giving them the tools for a successful marriage and a successful life. We want to teach that. We want Gogora, grit, to be part of our parish community, not because it's just right, but it's a way of holiness and happiness, and it's the way Christ gave us. So I'm writing it on the wall. I am writing it on the backs of their shirts, and I hope this generation teaches the next generation, no, this is the way to happiness. It's by becoming gritty. So back to the West Point analogy. Those people who succeed in West Point always had grit. For our children, we want to give them a great gift. No complaining, no whining how tough life is. We're not going to let a pandemic go by without making our kids better from it. So, I want you to pray all week that our school kids, our families, our parish, pray that what they learn from us is an example of grit, not complaining. And so, together, let us stand and profess our faith.